Hello there. Welcome back to Critical Weight Theory, where in this episode we're going to be questioning what we think we know. And today's topic, one that sits right at the edge of mystery and science, reincarnation. Ooh. So it's a bit of a different episode. I don't talk that much about topics like this one. So, more specifically, can it ever be proven? Or is it just the mind playing tricks? You know how the mind unravels and gives us some goofy stuff to talk about. So let's start here. No one has ever really succeeded at being invisible because when they were born, someone already was there who had seen them come into existence and presumably knew their name, at least in most cases, right? So it reminds us that from the moment we're born, we're already part of a story, witnessed, most likely named, and remembered at least by somebody, right? you know, but what happens when someone claims they've lived another story before this one? It's In this case, we're going to look at some of the strange things that children have said that led people to believe that they may have been reincarnated. So, children between ages 2 and 6 have been known to say eerily specific things like, "You're not my mommy," or maybe "I died in a car crash before." Just crazy things like that. You've probably heard of stories like that. There's an old anthology series that delved into a few stories like that. I think it's called One Step Beyond. So, these are sort of old stories already. Like people have definitely been talking about this type of phenomenon for quite a few years. So what exactly is going on here? Names, places, even events, detailed memories they shouldn't have are apparently sometimes spouted out by these kids. In rare cases, these kids speak unknown dialects or describe towns they've never visited, at least allegedly, according to some. I can't say that I've ever seen this phenomenon myself or anything like that, and I'm not an expert on it, but it's not your typical imaginary friend phase or whatever. These are people who in a way almost claim to be their own imaginary friend because you know, they've got some sort of spirit or essence that they claim to have or claim to be a part of, some residual elements of a previous life that somehow clung to their current form, or however you want to phrase it. So the people who have studied this phenomenon are actually real. There's a psychiatrist named Dr. Ian Stevenson who is no longer alive, but he did exist and he was from the University of Virginia. He spent decades studying this sort of thing. His team documented, I believe, thousands of cases across cultures, searching for children who not only told these stories but provided verifiable details like the name of a past life, cause of death, even family members. Now, again, I would be lying to say that I did the deepest research into this topic. I mean, I'm just somebody talking to a microphone. But the point is, people were doing this actual research, and apparently it hasn't been fully debunked. Sometimes those people, that had similar details to the claims made by the kids actually existed. They really did know some of the portions of the person's life story somehow, or that's at least the claim. So, can this be proven, or has it been proven? I guess is a more immediate question. Well, it kind of could be proven, but it has not definitively been proven. Stevenson, as the example I used here, he created a method to evaluate the stories, document what the child says before any outside information is introduced, or at least theoretically. He actually admitted that this was probably not the case in every single, you know, subject that he documented. He also had a guideline where he was trying to match the child's story to a real deceased person and wanted to make sure there was no known contact between the child and the dead person's family. He wanted to observe any behaviors that matched the supposed past life of the person, like phobias or habits. And the strongest cases, they're actually chilling. In a lot of cases, they seem to tick every box. A child says they were shot in the chest, and they're born with a matching birthmark. Now, okay, I'm skeptical of that really actually meaning much of anything. I mean, that sounds like more of a coincidence. But to some people, they hear that and it's like strong evidence to them. But another case, I looked into it and it says that one child named a village they've never been to, and later led their parents to the exact house of the person they say they used to be. Um, but here's the rub though. The skeptics were able to push back. That the bastards, they always are skeptical. That's they like to ruin everything. Damn atheists and damn skeptics. You know, Urgh. What are they? What are they trying to do? Spoiling people's fun like that. But many scientists and psychologists argue there is another explanation. There could be information leakage. Kids are like sponges. They hear things, remember them, and might not know the source. Maybe a cousin tells a story, a neighbor mentions a tragedy. Maybe the child overheard something on TV. When there's a death, it sometimes makes the news, and maybe they heard something about it, or somebody mentioned something they read in a newspaper or something. Maybe sometimes it's just a lucky guess, just a coincidence. I mean, the explanations pile up if you really actually think about them. So those darn skeptics, they like to ruin everything. And if the culture already believes in reincarnation, like in India or Lebanon, where many of Dr. Stevenson's cases came from, families may interpret or even encourage these stories. So there may have been some instances where there was a little bit of coaching somehow. Another issue is confirmation bias. If you want a story to be true, you'll start finding evidence that supports it, or maybe just make evidence up. That's just human nature, you know? And that's one of the complicated aspects of doing a study like this, because the desire to prove something might be stronger than the available evidence. So while Stevenson may have tried to control for certain things, critics say he couldn't eliminate all normal explanations. His work was suggestive, not conclusive, and in science, suggestive isn't enough. So, what does that mean? What does the science say, and what doesn't it say? So, there's a saying: science can never truly prove anything; it can only disprove. I suppose you could debate the logic of that. I mean, it seems like science can prove things, right? Like you do observe phenomena in the natural world, but still, like an example would be, what if I was to say, oh, there's a leprechaun living in my stomach, or like he's just invisible and you can't see him there. Well, you can't prove or disprove that claim technically because I'm making a magical claim. So it's hard to debunk magical claims. But in this case, there is some actual tangible information that could be cited as creating a plausible aspect to these claims, these claims of reincarnation. So technically, no one has debunked reincarnation, especially not some of these specific cases, but no one's definitively proven it either. Think of it like this: there are a few strong cases that resist explanation, but they're not enough to rewrite our understanding of consciousness or identity or, of course, the soul, at least not yet. So, you know, that that might be a bummer to people out there, but it's just the way it is. Researchers like Jim Tucker and uh, let me try to get this name correctly, Satwant Pasricha, continue this work, looking for repeatable patterns. Still, these studies often lack independent replication, which is a gold standard in science. So, in conclusion, the mystery still lives on here on planet Earth about whether or not there is reincarnation. There are some cases that some believe are suggestive of it, which I kind of went over a little bit. So, what do we do with this? Reincarnation may never be proven or disproven, but cases like these force us to ask better questions like, where does memory come from? Can consciousness transfer? Are children just creative, or are they tapping into something we don't yet understand? Maybe they're being coached again, as another possibility in a case like this. Maybe it's not about answers right now, but about staying curious and, just examining the world around us and trying to make sense of some, I guess, mysterious claims, for lack of a better word. So, as far as like my personal opinion on reincarnation, like I don't really believe in it exactly, but I will say that it is probably one of the more plausible sounding uh, theories about an afterlife because, if you think about it, a person lives or an animal lives or whatever, a plant lives and their energy goes somewhere, right? We know that the energy, you know, it's transferable, and that doesn't necessarily even mean it's going to end up in a conscious form, but there's at least something to the theory that, when we die, something becomes of us. We never truly 100% disappear, or so it would seem. So that alone makes it at least semi plausible that something, happens to our essence when we're gone. We become some part of the universe. In fact, we are already some part of the universe, of course, but it it is a transformation, I guess. A physical transformation. Everything is said to be a chemical process. There is a sort of natural explanation for what happens to the body when we die. We can study all of those things, and we have, of course. So we've already explained a lot about the nature of life and death. We know the anatomy and stuff like that. And if we don't know something, we can figure it out, presumably, at some point, right? Even if we don't have every single explanation, there's always the possibility of, broadening our understanding. So, the theory of reincarnation, it's at least a plausible thing that we could try to understand in terms of what what happens to our energy or our essence when we die. I mean, I'm not really that much of a physicist, but you know the idea of subatomic uh, stuff is interesting. You know what I mean? Like you don't really even need to know that much about it to have theories about it, of course, and that is, I think, what leads people into belief in reincarnation because they don't necessarily understand what happens after a life has gone. So it's a sort of naturally occurring belief that, well, that person's essence has to go somewhere. So there's sort of it's a little bit more of a naturalistic uh, thing to believe in. I think it borders on being more naturalistic or as naturalistic as supernatural. I'll just put it that way. I mean, you could have a bunch of supernatural stuff thrown into it, but it doesn't need that as much as certain other religious or spiritual claims, or however you want to put it, like the idea of heaven or hell, right? Those are more fantastical claims than reincarnation, I guess, if I want to put it more simply. And that's why I'm not a believer in it, but it sounds more plausible, I guess. So I've been rambling enough about this, so I might as well wind up the episode before my mind unravels. And if you've ever heard a child say something unexplainable, like about having a past life or something, or if you think you've lived before, feel free to email me at wadewinio@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your little story, and maybe I could talk about it here. We can maybe do a continuation on this topic. And remember, just because something hasn't been proven doesn't mean it isn't real. However, that doesn't mean we should go around treating it like it's been 100% verified either, right? So, all right, I'm going to stop yapping now, and you have a good day.